Hello, welcome to our next in the series of webinars on the Solicitor's Qualifying Examination, or the SQE. I hope you're all doing okay in lockdown number 3. You join us on a rain-sodden, windswept day in Birmingham where I am, and to get me in the mood for this webinar, I've been having an extensive debate with my 2 young children who are in the house about the merits of a day-long disco. I've told them that I will be prioritising a discussion on qualifying work experience, or QWE, as we may dip into referring to at certain points, but they're not convinced that QWE should trump the need to dance to the YMCA. So let's hope the blockades I've put up between me and them hold firm so they don't interrupt with that. So for those who don't know me, I'm Ben at the SRA, and I'm joined a few miles down the road by Richard Williams. And it seems that Richard and me have both decided almost telepathically to wear the same or very similar outfit. Navy blue cardigans are obviously what is in vogue at the SRA at the moment. But anyway, beyond being obviously as stylish or not stylish as me, Richard is also one of the key players in developing our approach to qualifying work experience. And I suppose I'd like to flag that we've already done quite a few sessions on qualifying work experience. If you're joining us and you've almost got no knowledge about qualifying work experience, or you only have very basic knowledge, I'd recommend that you do have a look at some of our other resources on it. We did a webinar session at the end of December at our SQE conference. We did some earlier sessions earlier in the year, which are on our YouTube channel. And there's also some great resources on the SQE section of the SRA's website with guidance and templates and things that you should find useful. So today's session is going to be covering some of those basics on qualifying work experience, but actually we're going to be focusing more on some of the more sort of knotty, complex questions that we've had come in. We've actually had well over 50 questions come in, and I see there's some questions already coming in live. And if you do have live questions, click on the link below. You can submit them, put your name there, which is great, or submit it anonymously, and we'll do our best to cover off as many of those as possible. However, just one caveat around that. Some of the questions we've been getting in are really good questions, but are probably better covered off elsewhere. So we've, for instance, had quite a few questions come in on exemptions for foreign qualified lawyers, as well as what the situation is with SILEX members or SILEX fellows. We actually did a quite detailed webinar on that on the 3rd of December, so I'd recommend you go off and look at that. We've had some questions on apprenticeships, and we've already done some stuff on that, and we'll be doing some more stuff in the next few months. Although in summary, actually, if you do a solicitor's apprenticeship, you'll have your 2 years qualifying work experience covered. And then finally, there's been a sort of group of questions around really detailed questions about the actual logistics of submitting evidence. We will be publishing more information in the spring, so look out for that. But I would say that the guidance and template on our website gives you a very good idea, and I'm sure Richard will talk about this, of what you need to do if you want to be sort of banking information around your qualifying work experience. Now, so that's what we're perhaps not going to be focusing on. So what are we going to be focusing on? Well, there's 4 key themes we'll be covering today in response to the questions you've been sending in. So firstly, what's the situation with sort of previous work or retrospective experience? Secondly, will be about names. What do we call people who do qualifying work experience? Do trainees still exist? Thirdly, what doesn't count as qualifying work experience? And then fourthly, who determines what qualifying work experience is, and what's the confirmation process for that? We'll then finish off with some practical tips and maybe some more questions from you. So Richard is going to be the one doing most of the talking in this session. But actually, just before we go over and hand over to Richard, I thought we often start off by just reminding people about what the SQE is very briefly and how it all fits together. So hopefully you can see on the slide, there's 4 elements to completing the SQE. The assessments, you need a degree or equivalent, you need to meet our character and suitability requirements, and one of those 4 is around on-the-job experience. So qualifying work experience makes up one piece of the puzzle. Not all countries have that as part of their qualifying process. we think on-the-job experience is really important to developing the competencies, the skills, the professionalism, ethics that you need to be a solicitor. So without all those four pieces fitting together, you won't be able to qualify as a solicitor when the SQE is introduced in September later this year. So let's move on to the focus of this session. So Richard, perhaps it'd be worth just starting off with a reminder about, what qualifying work experience is.
Thanks, Ben. I think the first point, and it's on the slide there, is that any individual who wishes to be admitted as a solicitor once the SQE comes into effect later on this year needs to undertake and complete a period of qualifying work experience, and we'll explain a little bit more about what that looks and feels like as we go through this webinar. But if we kind of strip it back, it's really qualifying work experience is any experience of providing legal services which gives an individual gives an individual exposure to some or all of the competencies outlined in the statement of solicitor competence. And again, you can find that on our website. And just to kind of point out that at this stage, that also includes exposure to sort of professionalism and ethics. And I suppose the purpose of qualifying work experience is to allow an individual to have exposure to those competencies, which helps them kind of develop as a solicitor. But also, those competencies are assessed as part of SQE2. The other key point really about at this stage around qualifying work experience, that it needs to be confirmed by a solicitor or CULP we regulate, but that solicitor or CULP doesn't have to have a practicing certificate.
Yeah, and I think we've had questions asking specifically whether somebody needs a practicing certificate or not. And yeah, you don't have to have a practicing certificate, but you would have to be on the roll, I think. So, Richard, obviously the current system has provision in place to get people with on-the-job experience, and that's what people know as the training contract. So does this replace the training contract that's in the current system?
It does, Ben. I mean, it replaces the training contract as a requirement, but that should mean that the current training contract bottleneck that we're all aware of, which is kind of part and parcel of the current qualification approach, becomes less of a barrier for people looking to qualify, because there's much greater flexibility as to where individuals can get this qualifying work experience. It can be through a much wider range of organisations and opportunities and placements as kind of under the traditional sort of training contract at the moment. And it's still probably worth noting that firms are still likely to offer training contracts, but you won't need to get a training contract in order to qualify.
Yeah, and I think so. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? One of the big problems with the current system is that you got some very sort of good and able people who perhaps spent a lot of money up front on something like the LPC, then couldn't get a training contract. And that could be for a whole range of reasons, from, they had caring responsibilities, they're located in a certain place, their face perhaps doesn't fit in certain firms, or we know it's very competitive just out there to get one. So hopefully SQE 1 and 2 will still be there to check people are competent, but it won't mean that someone who's very good can't qualify just because they can't get a training contract. So remind us, how long is the period that's needed for qualifying work experience? We had a question, I see, from Tanvir, and he's asked, does it need to be continuous? Is it a problem if there's large gaps between a period of qualifying work experience?
In terms of, I suppose, the period, the baseline is that it must be in total at least 2 years working full-time or part-time equivalent. It doesn't need to be continuous. And in terms of the part-time equivalents, we often ask, what does that mean? We know that we're not going to prescribe what a part-time equivalent means or looks like, because we know that actually many firms and many organisations have their own approaches to what part-time is in their organisations, and from our perspective, that's absolutely okay. In terms of the time as well, it's probably worth pointing out that qualifying work qualifying work experience can be obtained in up to 4 separate organisations that are providing legal services, but there is no minimum or maximum prescribed length of time for each of those placements.
Okay, and so there is much more flexibility. Do you want to talk through some of the types of organisations and scenarios where you can do QW or qualifying work experience? I know we've had quite a few questions around this.
We have, as I mentioned at the beginning, this, qualifying work experience does give individuals much broader flexibility about where they get their experience on their journey to become and qualify as a solicitor. It can be, qualifying work experience can be attained in organisations we regulate, so a law firm, as the training contract currently is. But actually now it can be attained in organisations which we don't regulate. So, for example, that might well be in a charity, in a voluntary sector organisation, in-house, for example. It can be obtained in England. It can be obtained in England or Wales, and I know we've had lots of questions about can it be obtained overseas, and those questions have come from Aya, Amelia, Marta, Leenam, and Willie, amongst others. And yes, you can get your qualifying work experience under this new approach overseas, so long as it is signed off by a solicitor or culp that we regulate.
And actually, just on that point, Alicia's asked the question, can it be a Scottish solicitor? And I presume she means a solicitor who's sort of on the roll in Scotland.
The key point is that for it to count as qualifying work experience, it needs to be signed off by essentially a culp or solicitor we regulate, but they don't have to have a practicing certificate. Just on that point, we are going to be producing more resources about what qualifying work experience looks and feels like in some of those kind of scenarios that I mentioned.
And so going on to the types of organisations, and we had a question from, I think, Aoife, and also a question from Angela, who've said, they're interested in what types of organisations you can work in beyond a law firm or regulated law firm. So we've got one who's working in a not-for-profit firm, another who's been working at a legal tech firm. Would that be okay?
Absolutely, so long as, through that placement, that individual is getting exposure to some or all of the competencies outlined in the statement of solicitor competence. It fulfills our criteria around time and length, but also it can be signed off by a solicitor or culp. As long as it's doing those things and ticking those boxes, then work experience can be attained anywhere, as long as it's kind of providing legal services.
Okay, that's really useful, Richard. So let's move on to our sort of first big theme, where we had a load of questions in, and thank you to Jessica, Chloe, Samantha, Thomas, Emma for asking questions around this. And this is all around sort of retrospective qualifying work experience. Can previous experience you've got, for instance, working as a paralegal, can that be used as part of qualifying work experience?
It can, and again, that's another advantage of qualifying work experience, that individuals can look back over the experiences that they've had and use that as qualifying work experience, so long as it meets our conditions. Again, we're often asked around the time limit. How far can I go back? Can I go 1 month, 2 months, three months? And we have not set a time limit on that. But if you are wanting to use experience gained from a previous role, there's probably a few things that you might want to think about. Firstly, you need to have a think about what you did and how you did it and how it helped you develop some or all of the competencies in the statement of solicitor competence. You need to kind of document and record that information. Now, we've got on our website an example template of how you might want to do that. So if you are thinking about using a previous role, have a look at that, because that gives you a really good template. You'll need to find a solicitor or culp in order to sign that off and confirm that you did those things. It was for the period of time that you're claiming, and keep a record of that, because you'll need to use that when we get closer to admission. And again, as you mentioned, Ben, we've got more information coming out on that in the near future. I think the absolute critical point is here, whilst there is that flexibility to go back and use previous experience, we will only accept qualifying work experience that has been signed off by a solicitor or CULP. And again, they don't have to have a practicing certificate.
And actually, we've just had a live question, Richard, but it seems relevant to this. Somebody's asked, and I presume this is from a solicitor's perspective, if someone contacts us to have historical qualifying work experience signed off, but we don't have evidence or can't remember what their role was or perhaps what they did, what should their approach be to I'm saying signing off, but actually we probably should say confirming, because that's actually the right term in the regulations. And the reason that's an important distinction is confirming is you're confirming those 3 or 4 things that you outlined earlier. But in that instance, presumably it would be difficult for somebody to confirm if they've got no record or knowledge to actually back up that confirmation.
Yeah, I think that's right, Ben. I mean, we place, we take the confirmation of qualifying work experience by a solicitor or CULP seriously. In effect, it's a regulatory obligation on them to make sure that they have taken the appropriate steps in order to essentially validate that information. Now, if a solicitor or CULP can't do that, then it's probably advisable that they don't sign that qualifying work experience off if they can't confirm those details.
And actually, we've just had one other question come in, and it's sort of linked on this. There's a link to this theme, and it's what our rules are around a solicitor signing someone off who doesn't work directly in the same organisation where someone did the work. So can a solicitor from a different organisation who that person's understands that work the person's doing, can they sign it off? Is that allowed?
That is allowed. Subject to an individual working outside of that organisation taking appropriate steps to make sure that they are comfortable that work has happened, it's of the right amount, the right time period, and that individual has had exposure to some or all of the competences before they sign it off, and they might want to think about, is there anything that they can see to review? They might want to have a direct conversation with an individual who's supervising or overseeing that individual's work that they're signing off before they actually make that confirmation.
And we've had a follow-up question on the same theme, Richard, from Amelia, and I think the answer is in a similar spirit. She's asked, does the solicitor who signs off on my qualifying work experience, and I said signs off because that's what the question says, but confirms qualifying work experience, do they have to supervise them directly, or can they work in the same organisation? And presumably the answer to that is you don't have to supervise directly, although actually that person might be in the best position to do that. But again, if they need to have knowledge of that person's work, is that right?
That's correct. It doesn't have to be someone who directly supervises or oversees someone's work. It can be any solicitor or CULP within that organisation, so long as you've said, they've got a good understanding and taken steps to give themselves assurances that that information is accurate and correct.
Okay, that's great. So let's move on to our second sort of big theme, and that was sort of around what do we call people? I've sort of called it here, and that is the sort of names for whether it's people who are qualifying as solicitors or people who are going through training. So under the current approach, generally an individual who's got a training contract is called a trainee or solicitor's trainee. And we've had the question, what should an organisation offering qualifying work experience call someone? And then just a follow-up question on that, because it seems linked from Afani, we've just come in, which says, if I'm a legal assistant or a legal secretary, might that count as qualifying work experience?
It is a good question, and we do get this asked a lot, so I think it's important we do call it out here. But there is no formal regulatory title for an individual is undertaking qualifying work experience, and I think the reason for that is that qualifying work experience is about flexibility. It's about broadening the range of experiences and opportunities where people can get exposure to some of the competencies. So to come up with a single term that covers such a diverse and broad range of potential placements would be really, really tricky. It's really, I suppose, up to the organization or the employer of a person who's completing qualifying work experience to determine what they're called, and that might reflect their employment contract or their role title. So an individual can still be called a trainee solicitor if they want, if that's the firm or what the organization wants to call them. But I think, just to be absolutely clear, unlike the current system where trainee always nearly means someone with a training contract, that's not necessarily the case with qualifying work experience. And again, just a reminder that, you can't refer to an individual as a solicitor until they've actually admitted. So I suppose kind of going back to kind of whether a legal assistant, etc., is qualifying work experience. Absolutely, the title to some extent isn't particularly relevant. What is relevant is the kind of the role and the tasks and the function of that particular placement, giving them exposure to the competences. Is it, does it meet our criteria around the time of qualifying work experience, and can you get that signed off? It's when you've ticked those three boxes, then that's when it is qualifying work experience. But the title doesn't particularly matter too much.
And we're going to go on in a bit to talk about a bit more about what might not count as qualifying work experience. But picking up on the point you made about that, once somebody does qualify and becomes is a solicitor, and what they're called there, we have had questions about, if someone does qualify, do they have to be called a solicitor then, or could a firm say, no, well, actually, for the purposes of working here, we don't think you should be called a solicitor or want to be called a solicitor? What's the deal there?
Okay. Once someone has been admitted, they can only work in legal services as a solicitor. So a solicitor can't be employed as a paralegal if they're working legal services once they've been admitted. As with the current approach, firms will probably want to have a conversation with their individuals during their qualifying work experience placement about the kind of the potential roles and opportunities that might well present themselves after they've admitted. And an individual and a law firm might agree together to hold off submitting an application for qualification until a specified date, depending on the outcome of those conversations. And again, that would be fine. But once admitted, they are a solicitor.
Okay, then that's really useful, Richard. So let's move on to our third big theme, which is what won't count as qualifying work experience. So there's more flexibility of what can be counted as qualifying work experience, as long as it gives an individual exposure to the competencies. But is there anything that is unlikely to be qualifying work experience? And just to add to that, I see there's a question from Fiona asking, well, do you have to do litigation? There's someone else asking, if I only do debt recovery, is that enough? So a few points there.
Yeah, I mean, we've had lots of questions, that have been submitted now and previously. Jessica, Freya, Maria have all asked us as well whether or not, qualifying work experience just has to be in one practice area, and the answer to that is it doesn't. It doesn't have to be specifically in one practice area. It doesn't have to be contentious or non-contentious work. As long as the experience or the placement meets those criteria, that we've kind of mentioned today, then it is qualifying work experience. But I do think there's probably a couple of exceptions, actually, when we're talking about qualifying work experience, where actually, it's probably unlikely to count. And the first one of those is really around exposure to the competencies. And if you've got a placement or a period of experience that is just, you're doing one single repetitive administrative task for the entire duration of that placement, for example, proofreading for 24 months, then that's unlikely to count, because essentially you're not getting exposure to some or some of the competencies, let alone all of them. So I suppose that's unlikely to count. And actually, if you're in that situation, you probably might want to ask yourself, is this giving me the best chance of passing the SQE2? Am I getting enough exposure to what might be assessed through the SQE2? And your answer to that may well not be, no, it's not giving me enough. So another scenario where perhaps it's not qualifying work experience is that we've said that simulated legal services won't count as well, and the reason for that is that qualifying work experience is about exposure to the kind of the real life problems, the real life issues, kind of the ethical and professional challenges that solicitors face, and simulated legal services don't often do that. It doesn't give that kind of face-to-face client interaction, so that's unlikely to count as qualifying work experience too. But other than those kind of two things, and again, as long as it meets our criteria, pretty much everything, as long as it's delivering legal services, it will count as qualifying work experience.
And so, and I think this is probably a key point is, and it's sort of a shift from the current system, is that message that a solicitor isn't signing off on whether they think someone is going to make a brilliant solicitor, or even whether their work's of a really good quality or a good quality enough to qualify. The SQE1 and the SQE2 assessments are there to assess somebody's competence. It's really against those core criteria, including the exposure. And we realise that's a bit of a shift in mindset, which sort of leads us on to our next theme. And again, I can see some questions coming in on this, and we've had questions coming in advance on this. And this is the issue of who decides what qualifying work experience is, and the process for a solicitor confirming, and when can they confirm and not confirm. And we've sort of touched on that in your previous answer, but let's kick off with, so who determines what is a qualifying work experience placement?
Okay. I think our position is that it's not for us as the SRA to determine what is whether a placement meets the criteria that I've outlined. That's very much for the individual and the organisation to determine. As I've said, most experiences and placements are likely to be qualifying work experience so long as they meet those criteria. But we recognise this is new, and as you've mentioned, Ben, this is a changing kind of mindset and kind of a different approach to sort of qualification. So more often than not, the default position is that a placement or experience is going to be qualifying work experience, and as a result needs to be signed off. And we'll talk a little bit more about sign off in a short while. I think the key thing here though is about clarity and understanding, and I think it's really important that at the beginning of any particular placement or period of experience, there is that conversation between the individual and the organisation to really have a discussion about kind of what it looks like and what it will feel like in terms of that placement. What type of kind of competencies will an individual be exposed to. And I think having that discussion early on and at the beginning will kind of reduce any kind of tensions further down the line when something needs to be signed off, because people have got that shared understanding around the kind of the range of competencies and what will be involved and the tasks that will be involved in that particular placement.
And if you want more details on that, our guidance both from the firm perspective and the candidate perspective sets out those type of conversations you'll want to be having. And so a follow-up question to that is, and again it's one we've had come in, is can a firm advertise a role saying that it's not going to count as qualifying work experience?
I think a firm needs to think about it very carefully if they are going to advertise a position or placement as 100% kind of not qualifying work experience, because they'll need to think about whether or not actually in doing so there is absolutely no exposure to any of the competencies in the competence statement. So I suppose the key message is firms, organisations think very long and hard about it before you're actually saying it's not qualifying work experience, because lots of different tasks and roles might well actually expose someone to the competencies in the statement of solicitor competence. But I suppose the other angle to that is what's in it for a firm to do that, or an organisation to do that, particularly from a firm perspective. You might want to be thinking about your recruitment and how best you can attract individuals to come and work for you. And one way of doing that is saying, well, actually the experience we offer will give you an exposure to some of those competencies, and it will give you a really good a good opportunity and a good basis for passing the SQE2. And again, that's in a firm's interest to try to attract good talent, isn't it? So again, that's something for a firm to think about when they're kind of advertising placements.
And I think it's a really good point, Richard. And actually, if people are interested in this particular theme, Julie Brannan, who's the director of working on the SQE, we've done a couple of webinars towards the end of last year targeted at sort of the firm perspective on what this might mean. And I think two big sort of questions are one around recruitment. What does this mean for your approach to recruitment? But also actually internal staff. There will be some internal staff that may be interested in qualifying as a solicitor, and there may be opportunities there in terms of career progression. Recognise there may be some people where it might be a more challenging conversation because they may not see. One person may have a view of a career path and the organisation might have a different view, but that's why they need to have the conversation with the individual. And I suppose that leads us on to our next question, which is, can firms refuse to confirm qualifying work experience? Someone's asked if it doesn't meet the right standard. We've set out guidance outlining what good qualifying work experience looks like, and Fiona's asked what happens if a firm won't sign off. So there's a couple of issues there. One, can a firm sort of refuse to confirm, and then two, what from a candidate perspective should they be thinking about if they're in that scenario?
I think it's an absolutely kind of critical question to understanding how kind of qualifying work experience plays out. I think one point to remember, you touched on it earlier, Ben, is that it's just a reminder that a solicitor or CULP signing off someone's qualifying work experience is making no judgment or assessment of their competence, and as you pointed out, that's for the SQE to do. But that aside, I think the default position is that if any experience that offers an individual exposure to some or all of the competencies is of the required kind of time period, and again, it might be a 2-year block, it might be kind of 6 months across 4 different placements, that is essentially kind of qualifying work experience. So that's the kind of default position. So I think we know that there is a nervousness on behalf of some solicitors and CULPs about signing it off, and we've issued specific guidance for those individuals to help them understand what is involved in signing off, and in particular how they can meet their regulatory obligations when signing off. So I just wanted to pull out a couple of key themes from that. So I think it's really important that a solicitor or CULP kind of does think about how they're complying with their code of conduct obligations and principles when signing off. For example, they need to act at all times really honestly, fairly, and not to abuse their position and take advantage of individuals. And then that does apply to sign off. So if it really does meet our criteria, then in order to be kind of in line with those principles and codes, they really should be signing it off. They'd have to have any deliberate refusal is kind of contradicts their, those kind of obligations in the code. We're not going to penalise an individual who has completed a placement where the experience was poor and not in line with our kind of expected standard. For example, they were inappropriately or inadequately supervised. There was no period for reflection, for example. We've got to point out that is still qualifying work experience, but we might want to look into that from an SRA's perspective to kind of understand exactly what happened and whether or not we need to take regulatory action. Again, I think just a pointer for an individual who might find themselves in a particular placement where perhaps they're not getting the full range exposure to a full range of competencies. Again, there are other ways in which they can get those. They can have other placements. They can get volunteering, for example. So just to point that out.
And we've had a question sort of linked to that from Anne Ritpal, who's asking around, could a firm say, look, we'll take you on, but even though you may have already accrued a good enough qualifying work experience or a certain amount, we want you to do a minimum amount of experience with us before you qualify? And I think that goes back to the answer earlier on. That needs to be a conversation absolutely up front, doesn't it, in terms of what your expectations are and what the firm's expectations are. But you can't refuse to sign off qualifying work experience if there is, because it's convenient for you. You need to, if it meets the criteria, then the default position is that a solicitor firm would need to sign it off. But you'd want to be having that conversation up front so everyone knew what the expectations were from an employment point of view.
Absolutely. I think what we're talking about here in refusal is, I suppose, it's kind of deliberate, really, isn't it? It's a kind of point blank refusal. So I think, 99% of the time, people will have those conversations. There'll be shared understanding between the firm and the individual. There will be, there will be ongoing discussions as part of being supervised, or someone overseeing another individual to make sure that it's progressing as it will. And there's, when it gets to the point of sign off, there really shouldn't be any particular issues. If there is, a particular issue with sign off, one option, we are getting a lot of queries about this at the moment. One option is actually, is there someone else within the organization that actually can sign it off rather than the person who's particularly refusing? That is an option for an individual to explore. So again, that the individual who's signing off will need to just make sure they've got the right assurances around the competencies, the time, etc. In extreme cases, it might well be that we as the SRA can probably intervene and have a look at an individual's period of work experience and take a judgment if there is, if an individual has exhausted all other options. So again, there is that possible kind of option from our behalf.
And that probably leads on nicely to the next question we've had, which is around how we at the SRA are going to get a sense of the quality of, the quality qualifying work experience that is being done. Yeah,
I mean, we are really committed to making sure, in so much as we can, that individuals and firms kind of get the best out of qualifying work experience. And that's why we've issued guidance for for individuals who can, how to maximise their experiences, but also guidance for firms on how they can kind of maximise it. But we'll keep a watching brief on this. And we've put in place a range of measures to help us do that. We're going to be setting up a qualifying work experience hotline, and that gives an opportunity for an individual who might be having a particularly poor experience. They might be, having their qualifying work experience refused to be signed off. There might be they might be deliberately obstructed from getting exposure to competencies within their role, to raise those issues and concerns with us, and we can look into that. And where appropriate, we might want to take regulatory action. We'll also conduct an annual survey of individuals carrying out qualifying work experience to kind of get a sense check of what's happening out there in terms of how it's been provided, how things are going, the challenges, but also the opportunities as well. What's working well, what's the positives that we're seeing out of there. We'll also take a more kind of in-depth deep dive into kind of what's happening with qualifying work experience through a kind of more detailed evaluation. But we also want to give and provide support to organisations, not just those that we regulate, but all organisations offering qualifying work experience, about how to implement this. So we'll be setting up a qualifying work experience community of interest, and what we hope that will achieve is lots of organizations will get together, share best practice, share learning, share stories, share success stories, and really try and kind of share knowledge and experiences about qualifying work experience. So everyone is kind of doing and providing the best that they can. So there's a kind of range of measures that we'll have in place in order to kind of keep this kind of sense check of what's going on out there.
So we'll definitely be looking at the broader quality of qualifying work experience. I suppose, correct me if I'm wrong from what I've understood from that, Richard, but we're definitely not going to be digging into the detail of every individual submission to try and assess whether we think it's accurate or not, unless there's issues being obviously raised either by a solicitor or the candidate themselves around that. And the reason we think we can take this approach is, actually, our regulatory approach is the default position is trust in the profession and in professional standards and the integrity of solicitors, because that comes with the qualifying as a solicitor, that they can confirm qualifying work experience that what's claimed for is valid. But secondly, the extra safety check on that, and we've said it a few times now, is SQE1 and SQE2 are there to check the competence. And actually, probably, I've seen there's a question come in, someone asking, is there a risk that qualifying work experience that is, confirmed may not be a sufficient quality, to meet the right standards? I mean, I sort of was trying to address that a bit with what I've just said, but I suppose just a reminder why we introduce this. Currently, training contracts are signed off by around 2,500 firms, I think. One of the problems around that is, you are going to get variable interpretations of what a standard is for a day one solicitor amongst 2,500 different organisations, inevitably. And then secondly, we also do know that the quality of qualifying work of training contracts can vary. Some people have brilliant experiences. Some people do end up doing more repetitive tasks that maybe isn't so good. And so what we think by qualifying work experience, you need that exposure, but then we have this one consistent check, which is the assessment, and that is the check on quality. I mean, Richard, I don't know whether you want to add anything to that question. Thank you, whoever sent that sort of point in.
Yeah, no, I think you're right there, Ben. As you've pointed out, there's the experiences of people in training contracts is varied at the moment. So there is kind of there's no consistent benchmark for what a good training contract looks like to some extent. And the guidance that we've put in place, both for individuals and firms or other organisations offering qualifying work experience, is really designed to try and help kind of show what good really looks like in practice. And actually, we've got a whole program of resources and information coming out that's going to build on that, so people get a real kind of understanding that actually, what does good look like when we're talking about qualifying work experience.
And it comes in. We've had there's a few questions I'm just going to run through that we've had come in. One we've had a question about is training for the SQE, and just a reminder, the SQE is an end assessment. It's not a course, so you can train however you want to take the SQE assessments, from being self-taught to doing online courses to getting on-the-job training, to going to university and perhaps having a course that incorporates SQE. So there's a whole different ways you can do it. But I suppose, again, one point we perhaps haven't touched on in that conversations you have with firms is that if you are doing qualifying work experience, it's probably worth having that conversation with a firm as, do they anticipate that organisation giving you any training specifically for SQE2, for instance, or is that something you're going to have to effectively self-serve? And either approach might be fine, but you need to be clear on that. We'll know some firms will be offering training contracts which will do totally all-inclusive SQE2 preparation, whereas others, if you're working in an organisation or in-house, might say, look, we're not going to fund or provide specific training, but we will make sure you get exposure, to the right competences. So I think that's an important point, isn't it, Richard, for the conversations?
Yeah, absolutely.
just a follow-up question. I think this is a fairly straightforward one, but it's from Miles, who's asked, if people have already acquired the relevant work experience, will they be able to upload their qualifying work experience to the sort of submit it to the SRA before completing the exams? And although I said we wouldn't touch upon logistics, I think I'm right in saying, Richard, that process will be up and running before the first SQE1 exams in November. We'll be announcing sort of what the process is there in the spring, won't we?
Yeah, that's correct. I think the important thing at this stage is, to have that experience documented somewhere. I mean, again, I've talked about the template we have on our website, but firms have their own, or other organisations have their own systems and processes. Kind of have that documented. Know who's going to be signing it off if it hasn't been signed off already, so that once it is possible to kind of submit it to us, you can do.
And we've had a question from Sadie, and I don't think I suppose it's really, thanks Sadie. She runs a law clinic at a university, and she's also a solicitor. And she's got a question around, so I'm just pulling it up here. She's got a question about questions from students who are asking, will this count for qualifying work experience? And then there's sort of further questions, because obviously some of those students are unlikely to be doing it full time. Some week they might not have clients. I mean, I suppose, Richard, we do plan to do some more webinars on this, and actually we had a representative from law clinics on, didn't we, on our session in December? But you've been talking closely to law clinics, and I think law clinics are planning actually working together to try and sort of talk through these questions of how much counts and what counts.
Yeah, law clinics are very keen as a group of kind of organisations to try and, I suppose, come up with a relatively standardised approach where possible for the kind of provision of qualifying work experience. So I believe that guidance will come out at some point in the summer, and certainly, as you mentioned, we'll be doing our own provide our own resources in this area as well.
And there's quite an opportunity there, isn't there, for law clinics? They want to get it right, but there's quite an opportunity there if it's part of your core, as part of your university, if you can offer the opportunity to gain some of the experience. I mean, you're unlikely to gain the two years full-time qualifying work experience that way, but you may be able to get one of those chunks that and as you said earlier, you can do that across 4 different organizations that could count qualifying work experience if, again, you can get it obviously signed off by a solicitor. We've had another question come in, which, Richard, I'll perhaps have a go at answering, and then you can chip in, from Jenny, who's it's someone who, a paralegal's done the LPC, but they've asked, can they use qualifying work experience to qualify? And I think the situation there is, we recognise there's quite a few people who've done the LPC, want to qualify as a solicitor, but can't get a training contract. If you're in that situation, you can consider doing 2 years qualifying work experience, so that if you're working as a paralegal, that could count with all those conditions about being able to get it signed off. And then you can look at taking SQE2 and passing that in order to qualify through, it's known as sort of the equivalent route, but effectively your LPC with SQE2 and the qualifying work experience on top could mean you could qualify that way. So that is an option for you. I imagine that's only an option for someone, or an option someone would consider if they've got the LPC but they're struggling to get a training contract. So let's just move on to, I'll have a quick scan through to see if we've got any additional questions, but I suppose I wanted to sort of finish up, Richard, with some sort of final tips. What's the take-home message for people on this in terms of practical tips for individuals who are thinking about, qualifying through the SQE and want to get qualifying work experience?
I think one of the key messages is, we have resources on our website, for both organisations and individuals. Have a look at that. There's a lot of detail in there, so that's always a good starting point. But I think, kind of importantly, it's to kind of keep an ongoing record of what you're doing. Really, what work are you doing? How does it meet some or all of the competences? in the statement of solicitor competence, and how can you sort of evidence that really, because that's what you'll need to be able to show someone if it's outside the organization who's signing it off, or internally, this is how I've had exposure, and this is how I'm evidencing. So I think the other one, and we've talked a lot about it, Ben, is have conversations at the very beginning, throughout, about what's happening in terms of the particular placement. Is it meeting expectations? Is an individual getting exposed to the range of competencies? What happens after? So I think that's another take home. And I think the final one is be clear on who you're going to get to sign off your qualifying work experience. So that might change through your placement, but make sure you've always kind of got a named individual. And actually, our guidance does say for organisations that they should be clear with you if that's going to sign off. I think that's all very kind of individual focus. I think it's important just to touch on those signing it off. And I think again, it's just a reminder that you're not making an assessment of competence. You're just simply confirming whether or not the period was of the correct duration, there was exposure to some or all of the competencies. And the third one, which we haven't touched on, is whether or not there are any kind of character and suitability issues. And again, with character and suitability, it's not about making a judgment. You're just simply telling us whether there have been or there haven't been, and if there has, what are the facts there? That's our job, to work out whether that situation or scenario should prevent someone becoming a solicitor. So I think that really that kind of covers off kind of the practical tips.
And just I'll try just to be. Thank you everyone for sending in the questions. We've had loads, so apologies to those we haven't got to. But just a couple more. Someone has asked about guidance for law firms, and I think in terms of this, now there is guidance out there for law firms, although particularly they're asking about the challenge of managing potentially two different, for want of a better term, cohorts, because there's going to be this period where some firms may be taking on people who have qualified through the LPC or gone that route, and then people who are coming through the SQE. I think I'm right in saying, Richard, that's obviously a decision for firms, what they want their approach to be there, although the narrower your approach is, the more you might limit down your talent pool. The requirements for the qualifying work experience, there is more flexibility there, isn't there? So actually it's less prescriptive than the training contract. I don't think we've published particular guidance about how to manage those particular issues, though we have actually touched upon this issue in webinars. Is there anything, Richard, that you would advise there? And it is something that firms will want to be thinking about.
I think this is where our community of interest comes in, Ben, because these are exactly the types of situations and scenarios that we want to support firms to address. So until that's set up, I think all we can say is have a conversation with other firms. What are they doing? How are they approaching it? But we are looking at producing guidance around how about recruitment and the SQE more generally. So that's a kind of a helpful, tricky issue for us to potentially address as well in that guidance.
Thank you, Richard. So I think we'll bring this webinar to an end, partly because I can hear my children almost banging on the door trying to get in, but partly also I think we've got through loads of really key themes there. I appreciate we may not have got to every single question. If you don't think your question's been answered, and if you don't think you've had a look at what I've signposted you off to, it's not in there, you can email us on sqa@sra.org.uk. We'll try and answer questions there. You can put a question in the comments below. You can also, we accept questions through our Instagram and Facebook account, Career in Law. So have a look at that. If you're a candidate, aspiring solicitor, that's a really useful place for resources targeted at you. I'd also recommend you sign up to our SQE update newsletter, which gives an update every month on what the latest news is on the SQE and signpost people to good resources. But hopefully you found that a useful webinar. Let us know what you think. I hope everyone is doing okay. And if you're having a bad afternoon, at least be relieved that you are not going to be chased around the house trying to avoid dancing to the YMCA. So thank you very much, Richard. Thank you everyone for their questions, and have a good afternoon.